What is up, guys? Welcome back to the final day of the Orillas International Chess Tournament here in Tenerife. My name is Titus Stromavicius. I'm a Grandmaster and I want to share my experiences and games with you from the event. So going into the last round, as you can see, I was placed in 10th place, but only half a point off of first, as well as in a big tie for third place. So if I win the last game as the leaders are playing each other, there's a good chance I could catch them and potentially share a tie for first place. Sort of to circumvent that a little bit, in the last round I got paired against another Chinese player, Huang Renjie, who up to this point has been performing close to a 2700 level in the event. If we look, he is in fourth place as a 2400, placed 38th in the starting list. So he's having an amazing event. I saw some of his recent tournaments. He's had good results there. He's beaten Wei Yi with black in a classical event last month. So my opponent is definitely up and coming and very strong, even though his rating may not reflect this. So it wasn't the best pairing for me, even though I have the white pieces in the last round. But we still have to play a game, even though he's having a great event and I'm having a so-so event. So a lot of things can happen. And when I was preparing, the round was in the morning, so we didn't have that much time to prepare. But when I was preparing, I noticed my opponent plays a lot of different setups. I noticed he plays, the Grunfeld setup with knight f6, g6 and d5. I noticed he played some Slav setups, with c6, d5, and then either developing the bishop to f5 or not. I saw he played some Queen's Gambit decline with e6, d5, So a lot of setups he has been playing, and I kind of decided after c4 he also played, e5. So I kind of wanted to limit his options a little bit, or try to limit his options. But what I was trying for to get in this game was mostly to try and get a Grunfeld, after which I would have played, so I started with knight f3, knight f6, c4. If my opponent had played g6, I would have played knight c3, and then if he had played d5, I would have taken and probably played h4, and try to get some sort of, a position that I could play for two results potentially, and apply some early pressure on my opponent's Grunfeld. Or I was also hoping that my opponent would play the Slav, let's say c4, c6 here, and I would have played g3, d5, bishop g2, and now my opponent has an option to take, which leads to some interesting theory potentially. Or my opponent can play, like bishop f5 or bishop g4, and we would take it from there in those setups. dc4 is also a move. So I really wanted to get one of these two setups, the Grunfeld or the Slav, and as if my opponent knew what I was trying to get, he instead plays e6, and all of my plans are spoiled. Now, the thing is that I don't really have a cohesive sort of opening repertoire, and if I had played, for example, in this position d4, d5, knight c3, knight c3, sorry, and then my opponent would probably have played c6 or c5. And I haven't really faced these openings at all recently, and I'm trying to sort of still kind of avoid them because c6, yes, it's a Slav, but it's a different kind of Slav. And it leads to sometimes very long and complex lines that you really need a lot of practice to, you have to have a lot of practice to play them proficiently. And after c5, it's kind of the opposite, where the lines are still long, but it leads rather to very sort of dry and solid positions for black, where white has to be very precise to try to get an edge. So I don't really want to go for any of this, and the problem is that my third option, which would be just to avoid all of this and go for a Catalan, well, now my opponent can do what I did yesterday and try to play for an early d4, for example. He can also take on c4, which I don't really have anything sort of fresh prepared for, especially with the round being in 10 a.m. At 10 a.m., I don't really have time to cook something new up. Those two basically options are the ones I don't really want to see at the board. So when I was preparing, I was, really hoping he wouldn't go for e6, but he did, and I kind of briefly glanced at some completely offbeat, some might even call it nonsense stuff with b3, d5, bishop b2, and I thought if my opponent goes c5 here, I'm just going to take, and if he takes, I'm not going to push d4, I'm just going to play g3. And if he knows, his stuff here, like good for him. I'm gonna get nothing out of the opening. It's gonna be sort of a very bland position potentially. But if he knows, if he doesn't know his stuff, then potentially I could get a good Tarash and get a timely G4, D4 in at some point. My opponent instead quickly blisses out B6, and now I'm in completely uncharted territory. I don't know anything here sort of concrete. I play these setups with a completely different move order. The bishop is usually still on C1. I usually have a bishop on G2 already. And it actually does, make a lot of things different. So I already started, thinking and kind of, hating life that my opponent, kind of tricked me opening with black at move 4. But that sometimes happens. I was trying to sort of go for what I wanted. It didn't really pan out. Now I have to deal with something I didn't like, and just make normal moves and see what happens here. I decided to go for a double fianchetto. My opponent also plays bishop d6, which I was kind of hoping he wouldn't for some reason, and then castles. And I started thinking here again, and I'm like, okay, I can play d4, get some sort of, I don't know what this even is, like some Catalan type setup where black is completely fine because he has developed his bishop on b7. His bishop is already in d6. Like all of his pieces are perfectly placed. So I don't really want to do that. Another option maybe could be, to try to play for cd5 and play for some d3-4 setup. Maybe that's possible. But instead I decide to go for d3 immediately. And my opponent, again, kind of blitzes out c5. And I decide to go for a very, very weird approach where I just take on d5, ed5, and d4. So basically, I provoke my opponent to play c5. So he kind of, I get the option of creating hanging pawns whenever I want or an isolated pawn. But my opponent wins at tempo, and he is perfectly developed. And this position is completely fine, completely fine. So again, I didn't get much out of the opening. I didn't get anything out of the opening. And I'm not really excited about my prospects so far. So my opponent plays knight bd7. I decide to play knight e5, which I thought was an interesting move. It immediately sort of tries to play against isolated, potentially, not necessarily isolated pawn, but the isolated pawns, where I try to trade pieces quickly. And my opponent kind of has to be maybe precise, more precise than if I, went for a slower approach. I kind of expected my opponent to play knight e4, which he did. And now I had an option, which I should have gone for, potentially, and the computer kind of likes. Not too much, but it's definitely an interesting option, where I just trade everything off, which is kind of what I was trying to do, right? And I go knight e7, for example, queen d7, bishop e4, d4, dc5, bc5 is the only move, right, because the bishop is pinned, and then bishop e5. And let's say my opponent plays rook fd8. I just take, and take. And we get this sort of weird ending with 2 rooks and a bishop against 2 rooks and a knight, which I thought was not very good for me because I thought the e4 pawn, okay, it kind of limits his bishop, but it also, grants him a lot of space. I thought his bishop could potentially be strong with my weakened light squares around my king. And of course, rooks are better with the bishop than with a knight because they complement each other better, right? Because rooks move horizontally and vertically, and bishops move diagonally, right? Whereas a knight is kind of clunky, and the rooks are too fast for the knight to keep up, basically. So that's why the bishops are generally better than knights with rooks on the board. But I do have some pluses, and they're pretty obvious. The isolated pawns. This pawn is a little bit far advanced, so it could become a weakness potentially in the future as well. And my structure is very, very solid. I haven't done any sort of damage to my structure. And computer says that this position is slightly better for white. And again, I couldn't really understand why it would be better for white, but now that I look at it and I know the computer's evaluation, it makes complete sense, right? I'm just going to target the c5 pawn as quickly as possible, develop my knight to c3, let's say, play for some rook c1, maybe with that rook, maybe potentially play for some changes, and then at some point try to bring my king to f1 and e1 to protect the e2 pawn and also protect the d2 pawn from invasion, d2 square from invasion. And maybe play h4, so it doesn't get harassed eventually with the rook on h6. And this position would have been very interesting to play. I don't know. I think it's still fairly double-edged, again, with the dynamics that the bishop creates against the knight. But it's definitely something I should have went for, and definitely a very reasonable approach. Instead, I played knight e2. And now we kind of have the option of doing more or less the same thing again, where we just give up our bishop on e4, play knight c4, and now we also keep the bishop pair or an extra bishop pair, excuse me, and we get kind of a similar structure. I think this is maybe a slightly less appealing for white because black has two bishops, so potentially those two bishops could come into play. But again, this is kind of the same thing driving for it should lead to the queen trade somewhere, because this bishop is always threatening the long diagonal and where the black king is at. So my queen can get active and potentially harass the king. And also, again, I have a sturdy blockade on c4. So this would be, again, a good approach to sort of try to play for a long-term positional squeeze, which, of course, I didn't do because I didn't want to part with my bishops. Sometimes you can't get too attached to your bishops, guys. That's the lesson to take away from this. So I play rook c1, trying to keep... I decided to try to keep a messy position, sort of a lot of pieces. But the problem is that black's pieces are very well placed. And I don't really have any sort of good way to try and create weaknesses, in the center with hanging pawns or the isolated pawn. And I can't really trade any pieces because I didn't go for it, now. And as black's pieces continue to develop, it just continues to get worse to go for these trades. I decided to go for knight df3, rook c8, rook c2, and computer loves black's position here. It thinks black has already a very stable and sizable advantage. Again, his pieces are perfectly placed. And I think one of the moves was bishop a6, just to sort of, start indirectly attacking things and potentially creating a lot of future pressure, basically. And play for maybe c4 as well if the position allows this, because, again, I can't really play for e4, for example, if the structure were to transpose after bc4, dc4. I can't really play for e4 because black has such a nice griff on the e4 square. So bishop a6 would have been a really sensible move by my opponent. I believe my opponent also offered me a draw a couple of moves ago. I forgot to mention it. I believe it was after, right here, I think he offered me a draw after knight f6, which I thought that was kind of weird because I think my opponent already clinched a GM1 with a round to spare regardless of the result. But he seemed a little bit nervous for some reason still, so I don't know why. But I felt that if he offers me a draw now, I probably can always have it in the bank, if my position deteriorates to a point where I can't really play for a win anymore. Or I don't think I can play for a win, at least. Surprisingly enough, or not surprisingly enough, but funnily enough, after this move, this might be already a position where I should just bail out and try to offer a draw in return, and my opponent would probably accept it. So... Fortunately for me, for once, my opponent didn't play bishop a6. He played c takes d4, and this move doesn't really make much sense because A, it creates an isolated pawn for black for no real reason, and B, it also activates my bishop on d4. It was locked behind the pawn. Now it's kind of looking beautifully in this long diagonal. So it kind of controls a lot of squares, and it's my best piece by far. My opponent now plays bishop a6. I decide to play knight d3, just to sort of, make the knight not hang anymore on e5 potentially in some lines. My opponent uses the freed up d7 square to develop his queen. I play queen b1, bishop c5, queen b2. And again, my opponent is kind of rushing towards draw. He has probably some other options as well, but decides to take on d3. E takes d3, bishop d4, knight c5. So we got an interesting transformation rather, where I have a bishop now against a knight, which is usually favorable, but I also damaged my structure on d3. But I also have a strong knight in the center, so I think white is very marginally better here for the time being. I decided to play with rook d2, and now my opponent makes a rush decision. He had already at least half an hour more on the clock, I think, at this point. Maybe not at least, but around a half an hour more on the clock. And he blitzes out knight e6, which is a horrendous move. And unfortunately, during the game, I didn't realize it, but I immediately spotted bishop h3, which was my instinct, to immediately play this. But then I started thinking, oh yeah, he's just gonna unpin himself, and I will eventually have to take, and he will recapture with the pawn, and oh, he has, no longer he has an isolated pawn. Um, the position seems kind of sturdy for him. I don't see any sort of play for me here, and blah blah blah, basically nonsense thinking. But in reality, this position is probably either close to winning or winning for white long term. I mean, with perfect play, obviously. Like with my type of play in this event, maybe not, but with perfect play, definitely winnable quite instructively, actually, because you can just pin black's pieces to passive defense, basically. That's all there is to it. You just activate your rooks, eventually you fix the weaknesses with d4, and basically I think eventually want to just reorganize your bishop maybe to g2 f3, so the knight can come to e4. So let's say knight e4, black plays himself, you play bishop g2, knight f6, bishop f3, and then I think in the long term you want to just start pushing potentially the pawns from the king side, where you have a kind of a majority where in with let's say h4, maybe h5, maybe g4, maybe g5, one of these breaks. And again, black is very, very sort of passive in this situation, and the only other open, or the only open file for black is the C file, where he can't really easily reorganize his pieces too. So this position would have been very nice to play for a long term against squeeze. But I don't know if it's lack of stamina, if it's lack of something else. I just decided to take on e6, and after queen takes e6, my opponent offers me another draw, which is illegal, but I don't really mind it because I accepted it. I thought already black was slightly better after knight takes e6, queen e6. After thinking about it for about 5-10 minutes, I realized that I don't really have any play, and he is more active. He's better coordinated, and he can even potentially try to play for some d4, rook c3, or some sort of setup like that. So a very, very disappointing game in the last round. Like, nothing really went in my way. The opening kind of blew up in my face. In the middle game, I had a chance to go into an interesting endgame, which I thought would be not so good for me. Computer says I'm doing very well, and then at the very end, on a move before accepting a draw, like I had a massive chance with the bishop h3 to transform a position to where I could play with no risk, basically, and pressure my opponent in a long grind. And with that, the event finishes. I finished, I believe, the tournament in 10th place. Yeah, this is the final standings. There we go, 10th place. Tied for 6th through 12th. Half a point off of the leaders. Abhijit Gupta surprisingly won the event, so congratulations to him. Very, very sort of nice comeback story. Losing in round 2 just like me, but then storming back to win the event. As we can see, a lot of Chinese players did really well as well, and basically 5 out of the 6 first places are from the Asian continent, so props to them. They did really well. My thoughts on my performance in the event, definitely ran out of steam in the last 2 rounds. Just really hard to concentrate somehow. I don't know, played sort of subpar in the middle games. Even round 7 where I won, I kind of had a nice position, then completely blew it, and then allowed my opponent to perform a very nice tactic with the queen sacrifice, which he didn't spot, fortunately for me, and I won the game, but still very, very murky. So, I think I broke even. If you look at my performance, I believe I broke 0.4 rating-wise. So, not the worst, not the best, but, this is the performance we have to live with. So, regarding the organization, I think the event was organized well from a financial perspective. It was good prizes, good conditions. But I also think that there is a lot of room for improvement because we were playing outside, and some days it was literally 35 degrees Celsius, the weather in Tenerife, so it was just unbearable, especially for the lower boards, which were playing sort of with a see-through roof under the sun. I don't know how they survived the event on those hot days. There was also some, wildlife like ants and lizards crawling in the playing venue. So that was also kind of new, so to speak. So it was definitely an experience. I think a lot of things can be improved, but again, the organizer tried his best, at least in the financial aspect of the tournament. and it was in Tenerife, which I've never been to. I've never even heard any of events happening here before. So it was definitely interesting to come and see what life is like here. But we can't, think about the event for too long, because tomorrow I'm starting a new event in Barbera de Valles near Barcelona, Catalonia. It's an open event. I believe I'm second seated, so I'm not sure if it's on the par with this event. So I might not make recaps of the games there. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to sort of recap my experiences from Barbera. Again, starts tomorrow, so very quickly. This was Orillas de Mar International Chess Tournament in Tenerife. Grandmaster Titus Stromavicius reporting. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the future events.